My mother was the Queen for a very long time.
And I need to say that. And we're very grateful for this opportunity to you, but also your response to that.
No headlines, no speeches, just silent goodbyes and a trail of royal heartbreak. Princess Anne's sudden departure from Edinburgh is stirring rumors of a hidden truth buried deep inside palace walls. What really made her leave? You won't believe what she left behind. Watch till the end and hit subscribe. There were no trumpets, no photographers crowding the gate, just a quiet car pulling away from a beloved residence and a group of loyal staff left standing in disbelief. Princess Anne, known for her unwavering dedication and no-nonsense attitude, had just left her Edinburgh home. And this time, it wasn't for an engagement or a royal tour. She wasn't coming back. The news didn't come through official channels. There was no press release, no farewell ceremony. Those who had served her for decades were caught completely off guard. The mood turned somber, with many close aides reportedly in tears. "She was more than a royal," said one longtime housekeeper. "She was family." Inside the estate, a quiet sadness lingered. Anne didn't offer final words in front of cameras. Instead, before stepping into the vehicle, she handed her private secretary a sealed envelope. It wasn't meant for the press. It was a message for the people who stood by her for years. "You have been my home," the letter read. Simple, honest, and deeply emotional. It spoke volumes about the depth of connection between Anne and her staff. But just as the message brought tears, it also sparked questions. Why now? Why so sudden? Anne's ties to the Edinburgh estate weren't just professional. She had spent decades there, forging bonds with people, hosting guests, and carrying out duties with consistency. The estate was her second home, a place of routine and reflection. And yet she left it all behind, with barely a word. Those who knew her best say she looked peaceful but heavy-hearted in her final days. It didn't feel like a vacation. It felt like a departure. A quiet one, yes, but one that seemed to carry the weight of something much bigger than a move. What was behind this decision? Was it personal? Was it driven by something deeper, something unspoken? Rumors began to swirl within palace walls, but no one had answers. All they had was Anne's quiet exit, a farewell note, and a gnawing sense that this wasn't just a goodbye. It was the start of something no one saw coming, because what Anne left behind in her study would soon rewrite everything. After Anne's car disappeared down the long, tree-lined road, her staff slowly returned to the home that no longer felt the same. They gathered in hushed tones, some avoiding eye contact, others walking the halls as if hoping she might change her mind and return. But what truly set off whispers among those left behind wasn't just her sudden exit. It was what she left in her private study. Her private quarters were typically untouched without permission, but her senior aide, following Anne's final instructions, entered the study that afternoon and went straight to her desk. Inside a lower drawer, carefully placed and locked, was a worn leather-bound journal. No crest, no markings, just soft, aged leather and a sense that it had been opened many, many times. It wasn't just a diary. It was a window into her private thoughts, going back years. Every page reportedly carried her voice, reflective, sometimes sorrowful, and remarkably honest. The journal wasn't filled with palace gossip or scandalous claims. Instead, it captured feelings, those quiet concerns that no royal press release could ever touch. According to someone who briefly reviewed it, one line stood out above all. "The day everything changed, I knew I couldn't stay." That line sparked speculation throughout the palace. What day was she referring to? What changed? And what made a woman known for her loyalty and consistency finally walk away? The journal painted a slow-burning picture of emotional weariness. There were entries that spoke of fading traditions, decisions that didn't sit right, and a growing sense that duty had shifted into something colder. But it wasn't angry. It was written with care, almost like a message left behind for someone to understand when they were ready to hear it. One of the final instructions Anne gave was clear. The journal was to be handed to one specific person, not King Charles, not her children, not even palace security. Just one trusted aide, someone who had stood by her through years of transitions and silence. That alone raised eyebrows. Why so much care? Why so specific? And why now? It became clear this wasn't just a personal goodbye. It was a quiet passing of truth, one she couldn't speak aloud but knew needed to be preserved. And when the aide read further, the pieces started to connect. There were mentions of tense conversations behind closed doors, changes Anne disagreed with, and reflections on the values her mother had once held dear. But the most startling part wasn't the journal itself. It was the final clue tucked inside it, a mention of something else Anne had kept hidden for months. A letter, one written not by Anne, but by Queen Elizabeth herself. And that letter, long kept in secret, was about to surface and change everything. The journal had more than just emotional reflections. It quietly outlined a shift that Anne had been observing for years. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Her words weren't bitter, but they were clear. The palace was changing, and not in ways she believed honored the values she had grown up with. Anne had always been viewed as the workhorse of the royal family. Tireless, unshaken by public pressure, and committed to duty above all else. She didn't seek the spotlight, and she didn't chase public approval. Her loyalty had been to the institution, but that loyalty came with expectations. Chief among them, that duty should never be replaced by strategy. But according to entries in the journal, Anne began to sense a quiet erosion. Decisions were being made with less regard for tradition. Roles shifted, not because of merit or service, but to fit a modern image. Long-trusted customs were being revised, or removed entirely. She wrote about meetings where her input was welcomed, but not really heard. She described the growing emphasis on public relations, and how often she felt like the old ways were being pushed aside to make room for a new curated version of monarchy. "We are not meant to perform," she wrote. "We are meant to serve." What stood out wasn't just her disappointment, it was her restraint. She didn't name names easily, but when she did, it carried weight. According to a senior palace insider, Anne made subtle mentions of internal discussions that left her uneasy. She wasn't trying to stir trouble. She was documenting a quiet internal conflict between tradition and transition. Some entries hinted at disagreements with key figures in the palace. Not hostile confrontations, but philosophical divides. Anne believed in continuity, others seemed more focused on rebranding. Change isn't the problem, she noted in one passage, but forgetting why we exist, that is. Staff who saw parts of the journal said it read like a slow goodbye, not to the people around her, but to the role she had once been so proud to fill. And then came the entry that shifted the tone entirely. A reference to a sealed letter, one she received after Queen Elizabeth's passing, one she never told anyone about, until now. Because that letter wasn't just personal, it was something that could ripple through the entire royal family. Not long after the Queen's funeral, Anne returned to Edinburgh with something in her bag that no one else knew about. Tucked among her belongings was a letter, handwritten, sealed, and addressed not to a department or an institution, but to her personally. It had been discovered in one of the Queen's most private collections, folded neatly and stored in a small leather pouch with her initials in gold. There were no grand declarations or official markings, just her unmistakable handwriting and a message meant only for Anne's eyes. When Anne opened it, she reportedly froze, not out of shock, but with the weight of understanding. The Queen, her mother, had given her something she couldn't ignore. Not just affection, not just praise, but clarity. A final message from a monarch to her daughter, written in private and held in trust until the right moment came. The letter didn't include King Charles's name. It didn't mention Camilla either. In fact, it barely spoke of titles or lineage at all. It focused on one figure, Catherine. According to those who later heard excerpts, the Queen described Catherine as the future's anchor. She praised her for qualities that don't grab headlines, grace under pressure, quiet strength, and an unshakable sense of duty. "Do not measure her by title," the Queen reportedly wrote, "but by the steadiness she brings to the storm." The message was simple but powerful. It wasn't a demand, it was a vision. Anne kept the letter to herself for weeks, possibly months. She had known her mother better than anyone, and she understood the importance of timing. But when she saw how decisions were unfolding in the palace, when she noticed that this message was being quietly overlooked, she made up her mind. It had to be shared. Not with the press, not with the public, just with two people, Charles and William. The decision wasn't about betrayal, it was about responsibility. The Queen had chosen Anne as her messenger for a reason. She trusted her daughter not just to receive the truth, but to know when it needed to be passed on. The moment had come, and Anne knew it might not be well received. But she also knew what the letter meant. It wasn't just a nod to Catherine, it was a shift. A recognition that the heart of the monarchy might lie not with the crown's heir, but with the woman who stood quietly beside him. What happened next would take place behind closed doors, but the echoes of that meeting would eventually reach every corner of the royal household. The setting was quiet, a single room inside Windsor Castle, well past sunset. No press, no advisors, just 3 members of the royal family: Princess Anne, King Charles, and Prince William. The atmosphere was calm, but the weight of what was about to unfold was unmistakable. Anne had brought the Queen's letter, not a copy, the original. She laid it gently on the table between them. There were no theatrics, no grand declarations, just silence, and the faint sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Charles looked at it first, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. Then William leaned forward, reading the lines written by his late grandmother. For a few minutes, no one spoke. The room was frozen in thought. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "This changes nothing," he said, but his tone, though firm, carried tension. Anne didn't argue. She wasn't there to debate. She had fulfilled her duty, to share what had been entrusted to her. "She trusted me to show you this," Anne said quietly. "She wanted you to know, before it was too late." William remained still, his expression unreadable. But insiders say he looked torn. The letter wasn't an attack. It was a reflection. It spoke of the Queen's hope for the monarchy's future, her admiration for Catherine, and her belief in quiet leadership over tradition alone. Charles, on the other hand, seemed more unsettled. It wasn't just what the letter said, it was that it didn't mention him at all. The Queen hadn't acknowledged his legacy. Instead, she had chosen to write about the woman now married to his heir. The conversation didn't last long. There was no yelling, no resolution, just a lingering sense that something had shifted. Not in titles or succession, but in spirit. Anne stood, nodded once, and left the room. She had delivered the truth. What the others would do with it was now out of her hands. Catherine never sought the crown's spotlight. She never rushed to give great speeches or steal attention during public events. Yet, over time, she became one of the most respected figures in the royal family, quietly, consistently, and, as it turns out, powerfully. Queen Elizabeth had watched Catherine closely, not in a critical way, but with a grandmother's eye for character. What she saw wasn't glamour or charm, it was steady, a natural grace that didn't ask for recognition but earned it all the same. Behind palace doors, aides often noted how the Queen spoke of Catherine. "She listens more than she speaks," one former staff member recalled. That alone set her apart. In a family where public image often takes center stage, Catherine stood still and let her work speak for itself. Charity visits, hospital engagements, long tours abroad, Catherine was there, always prepared, always present. Not dramatic, not dazzling, but dependable. That quiet strength echoed something deeply familiar to the Queen, something she had seen before, in herself and perhaps most clearly in her daughter Anne. Anne noticed it too. The 2 women shared more than a schedule full of appearances. They shared an approach: do the work, avoid the fuss. And it's no surprise that Anne, known for her no-nonsense dedication, would find a kindred spirit in Catherine. So when Anne opened the Queen's letter and read the words of admiration for Catherine, she wasn't shocked. She was relieved. It confirmed what she had come to believe over time, that Catherine represented not just the future by marriage, but by merit. The letter made no mention of formal titles or ceremonial positions. It didn't need to. It focused on character, endurance, the ability to remain calm through chaos. Those were the qualities the Queen valued. Those were the qualities she hoped would guide the family in years to come. And while others inside the palace were still processing what that letter meant, Anne had already found her answer. She saw the Queen's message not as a shift in hierarchy, but as a torch being passed from one quiet force to another. But not everyone welcomed this silent handover, especially not the man who had waited his entire life to wear the crown. King Charles had waited decades for this moment. His entire life had been shaped by the knowledge that he would one day become king. So when Anne sat him down and presented their mother's letter, one that praised Catherine, not him, something changed. He didn't explode. Charles wasn't known for dramatic outbursts, but his reaction, according to insiders, was unmistakably tense. He reportedly placed a hand on the table, exhaled sharply, and said, "This changes nothing." But it did. The Queen's words, though private, struck a nerve. Not because they challenged his role as monarch, but because they didn't mention him at all. For someone who had spent years rebuilding his public image, managing royal responsibilities, and presenting Camilla as queen consort, the silence in that letter was louder than any statement. According to palace staff, Charles withdrew in the days following the meeting. He didn't lash out. Instead, he avoided conversations about it altogether. His schedule continued, appearances were made, but those close to him noticed a shift, a kind of emotional retreat. For Charles, this letter was more than a message. It was a reminder that legacy isn't something inherited, it's something earned. And in the eyes of the Queen, that legacy now rested on someone else's shoulders. He had spent years navigating public opinion, guiding the royal family through modern times. But the Queen had written her final thoughts in private, choosing to highlight Catherine's consistency rather than her son's long preparation. That quiet omission stung. Still, Charles didn't contest the letter publicly. He carried on, as royals do, but his inner circle reported a colder tone in his decision-making. Subtle changes in communication, careful control of appearances, and a renewed focus on structure. Some saw it as a sign of determination, others as an effort to hold on tighter to what was left of his vision. Either way, Charles was left facing a reality he hadn't anticipated, that the crown, though his by succession, might now be symbolically associated with someone else. And while Charles worked to maintain his authority, another family member found himself stuck in between, torn between loyalty to his father and belief in his wife. For Prince William, the letter was more than just a message from his grandmother. It was a shift in perspective that hit close to home. He had spent his life preparing to follow in his father's footsteps, but now he was being asked to consider a different path, one where his wife, Catherine, was the one quietly chosen to carry the crown's spirit forward. When Anne read the Queen's words aloud in that quiet room, William reportedly said nothing at first. He didn't protest. He didn't ask for clarification. He simply looked down, his hands clasped tightly, lost in thought. Insiders say he was overwhelmed, not with anger, but with the weight of responsibility. For years, he and Catherine had operated as a team. Every royal appearance, every public duty, they had stood side by side. But the Queen's letter painted a different picture. Catherine wasn't just his partner, she was in many ways the future. Anne, always calm and clear, reassured him. "Your role still matters," she said gently, "but hers guides it." It wasn't about stepping aside, it was about stepping together, with a new understanding of how the monarchy must evolve. William loved Catherine deeply. That was never in question, but the letter challenged him to rethink what leadership could look like. Could he support a vision where his wife stood at the heart of the institution, not just beside him, but slightly ahead? It was a personal test, and a historic one, because what the Queen had written wasn't a rejection of William's role. It was a subtle redirection of focus, not from prince to princess, but from title to trust. William didn't respond that day, but those who know him say he left the meeting more introspective than ever. The decision ahead wasn't just about family loyalty, it was about the monarchy's identity in a changing world. And while he wrestled with that decision privately, far from Windsor, Princess Anne was quietly preparing for the end of her time in Edinburgh, a departure that would carry just as much meaning as the Queen's letter itself. In the days following the private meeting, Princess Anne returned to Edinburgh. There were no cameras waiting at the gate, no reporters asking questions. Just the stillness of a residence she had called home for decades, and a woman preparing to leave it behind. Those close to her said she followed her routine as usual. Early mornings, walks through the garden, private moments in her study, but something had changed. The air around her was quieter, heavier. She seemed peaceful, one longtime staff member recalled, but it wasn't the kind of peace you find after rest. It was the kind that comes after making a hard decision. Anne didn't speak publicly about her departure. She didn't hold meetings or give interviews. Instead, she expressed her farewells through small, deeply personal gestures. A signed photograph left for the gardener's son, who had once brought her tea on rainy mornings. A handwritten note to the housekeeper who had worked in the residence for over 15 years. Quiet nods, soft thank yous, and the unmistakable sense that this wasn't just a pause, it was an ending. In the corner of her study, the leather journal remained locked in its drawer. She didn't touch it again. Her final words had already been written. For the staff, the final morning was the most emotional. Anne exited through the side door, as she always did, avoiding ceremony. But gathered outside, lining the driveway, were the people who had served her faithfully, some for over 2 decades. There were no speeches, just teary eyes, a few brave smiles, and silent goodbyes. One valet whispered, "She was the only one who treated us like people, not just staff." Another added, "She never needed a crowd, she made you feel seen." As her car rolled past the gates, no one waved flags, but hearts were heavy. Anne didn't just leave a building. She left behind a way of working, a way of leading quietly, without applause. Her absence marked the close of something deeply valued inside the royal household, something harder to replace than any title or position. And while those outside the palace may not have noticed immediately, those within knew. Something important had ended. But even as her car vanished down the road, what she had left behind was about to ripple through every royal corridor. The day after Anne's departure, everything inside the palace looked the same on the surface. The meetings continued, the calendars were filled, royal duties carried on. But for those behind the scenes, something vital was missing, and everyone felt it. Anne had always been a quiet force. She didn't draw attention, but her presence was grounding. She brought a steadiness that others leaned on, especially during moments of uncertainty. Without her, that sense of calm, of silent stability, was suddenly gone. Staff who had worked alongside her spoke in hushed voices. Some offices fell unusually quiet, others became tense. "We always knew she'd show up," one aide said. "Now we're realizing how much we relied on that." No one officially addressed her absence. There were no internal memos or acknowledgements. But in private, the conversations circled around only one thing: what Anne's exit meant. For some, it felt personal. For others, it was symbolic. A statement spoken not with words, but with action. When someone like Anne walks away, people notice. And in this case, it sparked quiet concern. Not because she left her residence, but because of why she left, and when. Whispers among senior aides pointed to growing tensions, shifts in vision, disagreements over direction. Anne had seen it all and decided not to fight it from within anymore. "She didn't slam the door," said one palace insider. "She just opened it and walked through." Even Catherine, though busy with her own engagements, was said to have felt the change. Anne had been an informal ally, someone who understood the burden of duty without applause. Without her, the balance inside the family dynamic tilted ever so slightly. And so, while the palace moved forward in appearance, inside, the quiet void left by Anne continued to grow. Because sometimes, it's not the loud departures that matter most. It's the silent ones, the ones that leave echoes in the empty spaces where leadership used to stand. Princess Anne never craved attention. In a royal world often measured by headlines and public moments, she defined herself by something else entirely: work. While others made news for their personal lives or public statements, Anne quietly clocked in more royal engagements than nearly anyone else in the family. Year after year, she visited hospitals, military units, charities, and local communities without ceremony and without complaint. Her calendar was consistently full, not for recognition, but because she believed in showing up. She wasn't flashy, and she didn't posture. And yet, to those within the palace and many across the country, she became a symbol of the monarchy's true foundation: service. Those who worked with her knew the difference. "She never made you feel like a tool in a system," said one aide. "She made you feel like your work mattered." That sense of respect flowed both ways. Anne treated staff not as an audience, but as a team. Her routines may have been strict, but they were fair. Her expectations were high, but always matched by her own discipline. Even outside the palace, she earned a reputation for being straightforward, sometimes even blunt. But underneath that was a sense of duty that never wavered. And that's what made her departure so significant. Anne didn't leave because she was tired. She left because something inside had shifted. She had always believed in the crown, but she also believed in doing it right. And when she felt that core value slipping away, she didn't argue or rebel, she simply walked away. And in doing so, she made a different kind of statement, one louder than any speech. Her legacy isn't captured in front-page photos or documentaries. It's in the people who served her, the lives she quietly touched, the values she upheld even when they became inconvenient. She was the bridge between the monarchy's old world and its uncertain future. And now that she's stepped away, the question remains, who will carry that quiet strength forward? With Princess Anne's departure, something unspoken has shifted inside the royal family. She didn't leave with fanfare or controversy, but with grace and finality. And in her absence, a clear message remains: the monarchy is changing. King Charles now stands without the one sibling who consistently balanced him, who served without distraction, and who carried on the Queen's tradition of work-first leadership. His reign continues, but the room feels emptier, quieter. At the same time, Catherine's influence is quietly growing, not because of declarations or press strategies, but because of the one thing that has always mattered most to Queen Elizabeth: character. The public sees it too: the grace, the calm, the steadiness that mirrors the very qualities once associated with the Queen herself. And now, with Anne's quiet endorsement through action and the Queen's final words written in ink, Catherine has stepped into a new kind of light. Let us know what you believe lies ahead for the royal family. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, And join us for more royal revelations still to come.